February 20th, 1943, South Pacific. Lieutenant Hiroshi Tanaka stood trembling on the deck of the USS Walker, his uniform torn and bloodied, waiting for the execution he believed would surely come. 3 days earlier, his Zero had been shot from the sky during the Battle of the Bismarck Sea. The American F-4F Wildcat had appeared from nowhere, 12.7mm rounds shredding his port wing before he could execute his evasive maneuver. Now, as enemy hands guided him below deck, he recalled the instructions burned into every Japanese soldier's consciousness: death before surrender. The shame of capture was a burden no honorable warrior should bear. His training had prepared him for torture, not kindness. The American corpsman who approached him carried not a weapon but a bowl of steaming chicken soup. "Eat," the man said through an interpreter, extending the offering. Tanaka hesitated, searching for poison, for trickery, for the cruelty he had been taught to expect. His hands shook as he accepted the bowl, the warmth of it foreign against his palms. In the Imperial Japanese Navy, he had been told that capture meant unspeakable torments, beatings, starvation, humiliation. Yet here was food, offered without condition. "They're fattening you up before the interrogation," whispered another Japanese prisoner, a young ensign with a bandaged head. "Americans extract information through drugs and surgical procedures. I heard they remove parts of your brain." The rumor circulated through the small group of 7 Japanese prisoners huddled in the makeshift medical bay. Each man watched as American medics administered morphine to their own wounded, wondering when the pretense of humanity would give way to the expected barbarism. Across the Pacific theater, a phenomenon was unfolding that defied all Japanese military doctrine. Of the 3 million Japanese soldiers deployed across the Pacific, fewer than 50,000 would surrender alive to Allied forces. Most chose death, by combat, by suicide, by charging into impossible odds. Their reluctance stemmed from a complex web of cultural imperatives and deliberate misinformation. Emperor Hirohito's imperial rescript to soldiers and sailors had made the mandate clear: never live to experience shame as a prisoner. Captain Robert McGregor, Chief Medical Officer at the POW Processing Center on Guadalcanal, documented the arrival of Japanese prisoners with clinical precision. Subject appears malnourished, exhibits signs of extreme psychological distress, refuses medical treatment, attempts to provoke guards into violent response, read a typical entry from April 1943. The medical staff had developed protocols specifically for Japanese prisoners, approaches that acknowledged the unique psychological barriers they faced. Do not make direct eye contact initially. Offer food before medical treatment. Allow prisoner to observe treatment of other Japanese POWs from distance. What puzzled many American intelligence officers was the absolute conviction with which Japanese soldiers expected brutality. Interrogation transcripts revealed a coordinated campaign of misinformation. We were told Americans collect ears as trophies, confessed a captured sergeant from the 2nd Imperial Division, that they would use us for bayonet practice or medical experiments. Another prisoner, a lieutenant captured at Tarawa, admitted, "We were shown films of Americans torturing prisoners. We believed them." The 28-minute propaganda film, Horrors of Defeat, shown to all Japanese combat units, depicted graphic scenes of supposed American atrocities, fabrications that became psychological barriers more impenetrable than any barbed wire. Aboard the hospital ship USS Solace, Lieutenant Commander James Featherstone supervised the treatment of 38 Japanese prisoners pulled from the waters off Iwo Jima. Their reaction to basic medical care bordered on paranoia, he wrote in his official report. Prisoner 17 became hysterical when offered blood plasma, believing it was an American poison. Prisoner 22 attempted to remove his own bandages, convinced they contained caustic chemicals. The ship's galley prepared traditional Japanese rice dishes, serving 2,300 calories daily to each POW, the same ration American patients received. The contrast between expectation and reality created cognitive dissonance so severe that many Japanese prisoners developed what American psychiatrists termed surrender shock. In processing centers across the Pacific, medical staff documented cases of prisoners who stood at attention for hours, refusing to sit or sleep, awaiting punishments that never came. Others compulsively performed labor without being asked, believing work might postpone torture. At Camp Tracy in California, guards reported prisoners who hoarded food, convinced that the regular meals would soon give way to starvation. Lieutenant Tanaka's journey continued as he was transferred to a permanent facility at Camp McCoy, Wisconsin. The 20-day voyage across the Pacific and through the Panama Canal provided time for the first cracks to appear in his certainty about American barbarism. Each day without torture chipped away at his convictions. Each meal, 3 daily totaling 2,800 calories, contradicted the starvation he had expected. The American guards, while vigilant, displayed none of the sadism his commanders had described in such vivid detail. Most puzzling of all was the copy of The Tale of Genji in Japanese that appeared on his bunk one afternoon, a small kindness so unexpected it left him more disoriented than any interrogation technique. As the train carried him deep into America's heartland, Tanaka pressed his face against the window, watching endless fields of grain roll past. "America is all farms," he noted in the diary he had been permitted to keep. "Where are the factories producing their aircraft? Where are the shipyards? How can they feed so many and still build machines of war?" The abundance of America's countryside presented a contrast that propaganda had never prepared him for. The enemy was not starving, was not desperate, was not clinging to final reserves as Tokyo Radio had claimed. The scale of American agriculture alone suggested a war machine of impossible proportions. The first night at Camp McCoy, Tanaka lay awake on his bunk, listening to the sounds of 3,000 Japanese prisoners adapting to captivity. Some wept quietly, mourning the honor they believed lost forever. Others whispered prayers for families who would now consider them dead, the shame of surrender being unacceptable to those left behind. Outside, 4 guard towers stood illuminated against the Wisconsin sky, each manned by a single sentry. Just 4 guards for hundreds of prisoners. The implication was clear. America did not fear them. America did not need to fear them. And in that realization came the first tremor of doubt about everything Lieutenant Hiroshi Tanaka had been taught about this war. The sun rose over Camp Livingston, Louisiana, on August 17, 1943. Corporal Masaharu Sato woke at 600 hours, as he had every day since his capture 6 months earlier at Guadalcanal. But this morning was different. He reached beneath his pillow and withdrew the letter that had arrived yesterday. The first communication from his family in Tokyo, forwarded through the International Red Cross. His hands trembled as he reread the carefully composed words from his wife. She was alive. Their son was growing. They did not consider him dead or dishonored. The 73 characters of her message had traveled 7,000 miles across war zones and enemy territories to reach him, delivered by the very people he had been trained to see as devils. Across the compound, American Sergeant Daniel Cooper watched the Japanese prisoners gather for morning roll call. "They stand differently now," he noted in his diary, "less rigid, less fearful." The camp's 3,000 Japanese POWs had begun organizing themselves into work details without prompting, maintaining immaculate barracks that passed inspection with perfect scores. The library, stocked with 1,200 books in Japanese and 800 English texts, had a waitlist for popular titles. A voluntary educational program offering English language instruction had 1,742 enrolled prisoners, nearly 60% of the camp population. What puzzled many Americans was the transformation in productivity. Japanese prisoners volunteered for agricultural work, harvesting 3,500 acres of cotton across Louisiana and Mississippi. At Camp Clarinda in Iowa, they cultivated victory gardens that yielded 128 tons of vegetables in a single season. The same men who had once fought to the death rather than surrender were now contributing to the American war effort with remarkable efficiency. Army engineers noted that Japanese-built drainage systems at Camp Livingston surpassed military specifications, using 30% less material while increasing water flow by 22%. Interrogation transcripts from this period reveal the psychological journey of the captured. "I believed I would be tortured," admitted Lieutenant Kenji Hamada at Fort Hunt, Virginia. "When this did not happen, I thought it was an elaborate American trick. When months passed with humane treatment, I had to confront something more disturbing, that perhaps much of what we were told about Americans was false." This realization led to deeper questions about the war itself. In discussion groups monitored by intelligence officers, prisoners began debating Japan's military strategy, its diplomatic isolation, and the decision to attack Pearl Harbor. conversations that would have been treasonous in Imperial Japan. Medical officers documented the physical transformation as well. At capture, the average Japanese POW weighed 59.6 kilograms and suffered from multiple nutritional deficiencies. After 6 months in American custody, the average weight rose to 68.2 kilograms. Dental officers performed 22,000 procedures on Japanese prisoners in 1943 alone, many receiving their first professional dental care. The 700-bed hospital at Camp McCoy devoted an entire wing to rehabilitative care for Japanese prisoners suffering from combat injuries. For men accustomed to the Japanese military's stoic approach to pain and illness, American medical attention appeared extravagant, almost decadent in its thoroughness. The American approach wasn't entirely altruistic. Intelligence officers recognized that humane treatment yielded better information. The 126 Japanese naval officers held at Camp Tracy became valuable sources on Imperial fleet movements, not through coercion, but through the slow erosion of resistance that came with dignified treatment. "We obtain more through coffee and cigarettes than any interrogator could through threats," noted Captain William Schofield of Naval Intelligence. The 38-page intelligence bulletin produced weekly from these conversations provided insights that conventional interrogation had failed to extract. Particular success came from allowing prisoners to correct navigational charts, ostensibly to help themselves, but providing critical information on Pacific shipping lanes in the process. What most surprised the Americans was how eagerly many Japanese prisoners embraced education. Camp libraries couldn't keep enough English-language primers in stock. At Camp Savage in Minnesota, selected Japanese-American instructors taught English to 380 cooperative prisoners, who in turn helped American intelligence officers understand captured documents. The 27-volume encyclopedia donated to Camp McCoy's library had a perpetual waiting list, with prisoners signing up weeks in advance for 30-minute reading sessions. At Camp Livingston, Japanese officers with university backgrounds organized lecture series on mathematics, literature, and science that attracted hundreds of attendees. Lieutenant Hiroshi Tanaka, now settled into the routine at Camp McCoy, found himself appointed as an assistant librarian due to his English proficiency. Each day he helped fellow prisoners navigate the 2,300-volume collection, noticing patterns in their interests. Technical manuals drew particular attention. Books on American manufacturing methods, agricultural techniques, and infrastructure development. "They study America like men preparing for an exam," he wrote in his increasingly candid diary, "not to defeat it, but to understand how it defeated them." In the evenings, after the 2,200 hours lights out, conversations in the barracks often turned to the disparities between Japan and America. The evidence surrounded them, from the 4,000-calorie meals served to American guards, compared to Japan's 2,300-calorie military rations, to the casual abundance of the camp's supplies. A Japanese soldier had been issued 2 uniforms for an entire campaign. American guards received fresh uniforms weekly. The guards spoke of home leaves, of family vacations, of automobiles owned before the war. Concepts almost unimaginable to men from a society where military service meant complete separation from civilian life. As 1943 drew to a close, American authorities faced an unexpected challenge: what to do with Japanese prisoners who no longer saw themselves as enemies. Some had begun writing articles for camp newspapers that criticized Japanese militarism. Others volunteered as translators. A few even requested to remain in America after the war, fearing the reception they would receive at home. The transformation was so profound that security at some camps was reduced from 150 guards to fewer than 40, as escape attempts dropped to 0. At Camp Livingston, the commander authorized supervised fishing expeditions to nearby lakes. 30 prisoners accompanied by just 2 armed guards. None attempted escape. Corporal Sato carefully folded his wife's letter and placed it in the small wooden box where he kept his few possessions. Outside, the Louisiana humidity hung heavy as he joined the breakfast line. The American mess sergeant nodded to him, a small gesture that would have been unthinkable months earlier. Behind the serving counter, mountains of eggs, towers of toast, and vats of coffee awaited distribution. As he accepted his tray, Sato glanced at the American newspapers posted on the bulletin board. Headlines announced Allied advances across the Pacific, islands he recognized, positions he knew could not be easily surrendered. but they were falling one by one. The immovable object of Japanese resistance was giving way before the irresistible force of American production. And in that moment, watching his fellow prisoners calmly accepting American abundance, Corporal Masaharu Sato understood a truth that would have been incomprehensible a year earlier. Japan was not losing the war. Japan had already lost. The first snowfall blanketed Camp McCoy on December 12, 1943. For many Japanese prisoners, it was their first experience with snow. Lieutenant Takashi Hidaka stood at the window of Barracks 17, watching American children sledding on a nearby hill. 7 months earlier, he had commanded a platoon that fought to the last man at Attu in the Aleutian Islands. He alone had survived, unconscious from blood loss when American medics found him. The 13 members of his unit had followed their orders, fighting until their ammunition was exhausted, then charging with bayonets fixed. Their sacrifice had delayed the American advance by precisely 47 minutes. "They could have left me to die," he wrote in his journal that night. "It would have been easier than carrying me down the mountain in the rain." 4 American stretcher-bearers died from Japanese sniper fire while evacuating wounded from both sides. They knew the risks, but came for us anyway. The pages of his diary, begun in captivity, documented his gradual transformation from a fanatical officer to a thoughtful critic of the war. The 217-page manuscript, later preserved in the National Archives, offers rare insight into the mind of a man caught between worlds. The Christmas meal at Camp McCoy that year included turkey, mashed potatoes, and apple pie, the same menu served to American personnel. The Japanese prisoners, initially suspicious of this unexpected feast, gradually accepted it as yet another example of inexplicable American abundance. What amazed them wasn't just the quality of food, but its quantity. In a world where rationing touched every household, American POW camps served 3,200 calories daily to each prisoner. Lieutenant Hidaka noted with disbelief, "Each man receives 8 ounces of meat daily, more than a Japanese officer's weekly ration in the field. How can a nation at war feed even its enemies so well?" The contrast with Japanese-run camps was stark and deliberate. While 37% of American prisoners in Japanese hands would die from starvation, disease, or mistreatment, fewer than 1% of Japanese prisoners died in American custody. The death rate among Japanese POWs was actually lower than that of American combat troops in the Pacific Theater. Medical care included access to penicillin, a scarce commodity reserved for the most serious infections, yet made available to enemy prisoners. At the camp hospital, Japanese patients occupied 43 beds in the same ward as American military personnel, receiving identical treatment protocols administered by the same medical staff. At Camp Kennedy in Texas, educational programs expanded beyond language instruction. Japanese prisoners could study mathematics, world geography, and American history. The camp library, stocked with 3,700 volumes, became the center of intellectual life. Instructors noted the prisoners' particular interest in American constitutional government and industrial methods. They asked questions about factory production that reveal how little they understood about American manufacturing capacity, reported one teacher. When told a single plant in Michigan produces more aircraft engines in a month than all of Japan, they simply refused to believe it. This industrial disparity became increasingly clear to the Japanese prisoners. Lieutenant Hidaka, in his December entries, wrote, "America doesn't win through superior fighting spirit, but through factories." While Tokyo speaks of courage and sacrifice, Detroit speaks with 8,000 aircraft per month. How can spirit alone fight such numbers? Similar revelations echoed through POW writings as men confronted the mathematical impossibility of Japanese victory. At Camp Clarinda, a former economics professor serving as a naval lieutenant calculated that American shipyards were launching more tonnage each month than Japan had lost in the entire war, a production miracle that made blockade and attrition strategies ultimately futile. The new year of 1944 brought change to the POW system. With Allied victories mounting, the number of Japanese prisoners increased. American authorities, recognizing the rehabilitation potential, expanded educational opportunities. At Camp Stoneman in California, Japanese prisoners could take courses in democracy, free market economics, and critical thinking. The curriculum wasn't subtle, it aimed to reshape worldviews, but neither was it coercive. Attendance remained voluntary, yet courses filled to capacity, with 2,700 prisoners participating across 28 different subjects ranging from practical skills like automotive repair to philosophical discussions of democratic governance. What emerged in this period was a small but significant cohort of Japanese prisoners who became active collaborators with American authorities. They published a Japanese-language newspaper, Oasis, which circulated in POW camps nationwide with a print run of 13,000 copies. Its articles criticized military ultranationalism and advocated for democratic reforms in post-war Japan. The newspaper's editorial board, composed entirely of Japanese officers, received no censorship from American authorities beyond security concerns. Each 8-page issue contained news from the Pacific Front, translated from American sources without propaganda filtering, providing many prisoners their first unvarnished look at the war's true progress. Captain Mitsuharu Nagata, formerly of the Imperial Japanese Army's 31st Division, led this transformation at Camp Clarinda. His journey from dedicated officer to peace advocate was documented in 86 pages of intelligence interviews. "I was prepared to die for the Emperor," he explained. "Now I wonder if Japan itself might die from this war. We must survive as a people, even if our military pride does not." By spring 1944, he had gathered 740 signatures from fellow prisoners on a petition advocating Japan's surrender. The document argued that continued resistance would lead only to the destruction of Japanese civilization itself, a shocking repudiation of the fight to the last man ethos that had dominated imperial military thinking. American intelligence officers watched this evolution with interest but skepticism. "These men represent a tiny fraction of Japan's military," cautioned Colonel William Fassel in his quarterly report. "They've seen American power firsthand. Their compatriots at home have not." Nevertheless, the War Department began identifying cooperative prisoners who might assist with post-war reconstruction, eventually creating a classified list of 2,200 potential Japanese leaders. These men received specialized training in civil administration, public health management, and infrastructure development, skills deemed crucial for Japan's eventual recovery from the war. At Camp McCoy, Lieutenant Hidaka celebrated his 30th birthday, an occasion he had never expected to reach. His wounds had healed months earlier, leaving only scars and occasional pain to remind him of Atu, the officer who had once led suicidal charges against American positions, now taught conversational Japanese to a group of American intelligence officers 3 times weekly. In the evening, he participated in a discussion group that debated Japan's future political structure. The 17 officers in this unofficial seminar represented a cross-section of Japanese society, university graduates, business leaders, career military men, all now questioning the imperial system they had once defended with their lives. Outside the classroom windows, spring was transforming the Wisconsin landscape. Cherry trees planted by the first Japanese prisoners were beginning to blossom, 63 saplings arranged in the pattern of the constellation Orion. Lieutenant Hidaka watched American guards photographing the blossoms to send to families back home. The same flowers that symbolized the sacrifice of Japanese warriors now provided beauty for their captors. In this strange juxtaposition, Hidaka found a metaphor for his own transformation, from an instrument of imperial will to a man contemplating a different path for his nation. The conversation in the classroom continued long into the evening, voices rising and falling as former enemies imagined a world after war. The final months of the war brought a surge in Japanese prisoners as the empire's defenses collapsed. Men who arrived in American camps in 1945 differed markedly from the fanatical soldiers of 1942. They surrendered more readily, adapted more quickly, and harbored fewer illusions about Japan's chances. At Camp McCoy, newer arrivals often learned about humane treatment from veterans like Lieutenant Hidaka, who had spent 2 years in American custody. "The new ones still flinch when an American approaches," he observed. "It takes them weeks to stop expecting punishment for minor infractions. They watch us interact with guards as if witnessing some impossible physics, enemy soldiers conversing without hatred." As Allied forces approached the Japanese homeland, intelligence officers began preparing certain prisoners for repatriation. The War Department's reorientation program identified 6,000 Japanese POWs considered receptive to democratic ideals. These men received intensive education on constitutional government, free press and economic development, training designed to create a cadre of potential reformers in post-war Japan. The program's 140-page curriculum, developed by political scientists and area specialists, covered everything from local election procedures to industrial regulation, delivered through 840 hours of structured instruction over 3 months. The bombing of Hiroshima on August 6, 1945, sent shockwaves through the POW camps. At first, many prisoners dismissed reports as American propaganda. The destruction of an entire city by a single bomb seemed technologically impossible. Lieutenant Hidaka, reading the technical specifications in Stars and Stripes, recognized the implications immediately. "If this is true," he told his barracks mates, "then Japan has been fighting a modern opponent with medieval weapons. Our courage meant nothing against such power." When confirmation came from Japanese sources, the psychological impact was profound. Medical officers reported 37 cases of acute anxiety disorders among prisoners in the following week, as men grappled with the fate of families in potential target cities. On the evening of August 14, 1945, the prisoners at Camp McCoy gathered around a radio in the recreation hall. Emperor Hirohito's surrender announcement, transmitted across thousands of miles, reached American soil before most Japanese civilians heard it. Lieutenant Hidaka, now serving as a barracks leader, translated the crackling Japanese into English for the benefit of American guards. His hands trembled as he processed the emperor's careful euphemisms. The war situation has developed not necessarily to Japan's advantage. The 171-word imperial proclamation, unprecedented in Japanese history, brought some prisoners to tears. Others sat in stunned silence, unable to process this final contradiction of everything they had been trained to believe. Japan surrendering while territory remained unconquered, while soldiers could still fight, while the divine emperor still lived. In the silence that followed, an American sergeant placed a hand on Hidaka's shoulder, a gesture unimaginable 3 years earlier. The war that had brought these men together as enemies was ending. Soon, the process of repatriation would begin, but Hidaka and 2,300 other Japanese prisoners had requested permission to remain in America, fearing execution as traitors if returned to Japan. Their petitions, documented in immigration service records, reveal men caught between worlds, no longer loyal subjects of the emperor, not yet Americans transformed by an enemy's unexpected humanity. "I cannot return to a Japan that will hate me for surrendering," wrote Corporal Takeo Yamashita in his application for residency. "The Japan I served no longer exists. The Japan that will emerge after surrender will see me as a relic of disgrace." His fears were not unfounded. Intelligence reports indicated that returning POWs faced significant discrimination in Japanese society. The 28,000 prisoners scheduled for repatriation received extensive counseling on reintegration strategies, including suggestions for explaining their survival without admitting surrender, creative fictions to preserve honor in a culture still processing defeat. The lessons of this psychological experiment echoed beyond the war. General Douglas MacArthur, overseeing the occupation of Japan, specifically requested former POWs as liaisons between American forces and Japanese civilians. Their unusual perspective, having experienced both Japanese militarism and American democracy, made them valuable intermediaries. Over 900 former prisoners would serve in the occupation government, their names recorded in SCAP, Supreme Commander for the Allied Powers, personnel files. Lieutenant Hidaka himself was assigned to the Education Reform Division, helping rewrite textbooks that had previously glorified military conquest. The 740-page curriculum guide he helped develop would shape Japanese education for a generation, emphasizing scientific inquiry and civic responsibility over unquestioning loyalty to the state. For those who returned to civilian life, the stigma of capture created unexpected challenges. Masaharu Sato found his family in Tokyo living among ruins, surviving on 1,200 calories of rations daily, less than half what he had received as an American prisoner. His attempts to explain the reality of captivity met with disbelief and suspicion. "They could not reconcile the Americans I described with the demons of their imagination," he later wrote. "My wife asked if I had been brainwashed. Perhaps I was in a way. Truth itself can be a form of brainwashing when you have lived with lies. The 300-400 returning POWs formed informal support networks, meeting in secret to share experiences too controversial for public discussion in early post-war Japan. Some found that their American experience provided unexpected advantages in the reconstructing economy. Former prisoners who had learned English became valuable as translators for occupation authorities. Those who had studied American business methods adapted quickly to new economic models. The 217 ex-POWs hired by Toyota between 1946 and 1950 included many who had worked in camp machine shops, gaining technical knowledge unavailable in wartime Japan. Their familiarity with American production systems proved invaluable as Japan rebuilt its industrial base with U.S. guidance and investment. Among the 345 Japanese prisoners who chose American citizenship after the war, Takashi Hidaka would become a professor of international relations at Columbia University. His lectures often returned to a single theme: how humanity, extended even to enemies, could transform not just individuals, but nations. The lesson, purchased at terrible cost across the Pacific, endured long after the guns fell silent, a reminder that in the darkest hour of modern warfare, unexpected kindness proved more powerful than the strongest propaganda. Each semester, he began his course with the same question to students: what transforms an enemy into a friend? The answers varied, but his conclusion never did. Not force, but fellowship. Not coercion, but compassion. Not propaganda, but proof. The daily evidence that humanity transcends the arbitrary boundaries of war. Dawn broke over Tokyo Bay on September 2, 1945. The USS Missouri stood silent as representatives of the Japanese Empire approached to sign the instruments of surrender. On shore, Lieutenant Takashi Hidaka watched through binoculars, no longer a prisoner, but an interpreter for the American occupation forces. The ceremony unfolded with formal precision, marking the end of the conflict that had defined his adult life. As the last signatures were applied, signal flags raised, and aircraft thundered overhead in formation, he contemplated the journey from the bloody slopes of Attu to this moment of transition. The empire that had demanded his death rather than his surrender was itself now surrendering. The nation that had captured him was now offering reconstruction rather than retribution. That evening he wrote the final entry in the journal begun in captivity. "When I surrendered, I expected death but found life instead. Perhaps Japan, too, in surrender, might find not an ending but a beginning." In this reflection lay the essence of America's most successful psychological operation, one waged not with threats or torture, but with soup, books, and unexpected dignity. The 32 months of his captivity had transformed not just his own thinking, but contributed to the transformation of two nations. Enemies become allies through the slow, steady evidence that humanity could survive even the crucible of total war. History would prove Hidaka correct. As American investment rebuilt Japanese infrastructure, as democratic institutions took root in former imperial soil, as economic partnerships replaced military confrontation, the lessons of the POW camps expanded to national scale. What began with a bowl of soup offered to a frightened pilot became a model for post-war reconciliation. In the end, Japan was defeated not only on the battlefield and in the factory, but in the psychology of its own soldiers, men who discovered their enemies were human after all.